Hey, this is the video post to accompany the first post on exposure triangle. This is going to be your visual guide if you're a visual learner. Okay, you have three primary exposure controls. We have the ISO, we have the shutter speed, and we have the aperture. Okay, first of all, we have ISO. And the ISO is the sensitivity of the camera or the sensor inside the camera to whatever light it sees. Back in the film days, we had ISO film speed, ISO 100, ISO 200, ISO 400. Now, if you've ever used 800 speed film, you should appreciate your digital camera a whole lot more than most people that have never used film would. 800 speed film was so grainy, and it was a cool looking grain. It was still so grainy that it doesn't even compare. So, ISO is just the sensitivity of the camera in a digital camera to the light that it sees. This camera only goes to, I think, ISO 400, which is fine for what this camera does. This one's pretty old. This one's not going to have as good of an ISO range as this one will, because you pay for what you get. Secondly, we have shutter speed. Shutter speed is actually a curtain inside that opens and closes very quickly for a very short period of time. So choosing a shutter speed, you can go down to a few seconds. You can stop it down to just a 1/8,000th of a second. That would freeze a rocket moving at a few hundred miles an hour. But not all cameras have that control. This camera doesn't have any shutter speed control. Some point and shoots won't have all that control. If you have an SLR, every SLR is going to have all these controls I'm talking about. Read your manual. You have to find your shutter speed control. Some of them don't have one. Alright, the last control we're going to look at is the aperture control. The aperture is actually these little rings inside the lens that open and close to let more light in or not as much light in. Wide open aperture will be a smaller f number. This one stops down to f22, which doesn't let much light in at all, and opens up to f1.8. Not all lenses will open up that wide, and if you have a point and shoot camera, chances are it won't open up that wide. The wider it opens up, the smaller that number, the more the lens is usually going to cost. What that aperture does, other than just let more light in because it's a bigger circle, it actually changes the way that the image is going to look by making more or less of the picture in focus. If I close it all the way down to f22, it's not going to let a lot of light in, but it's going to be very sharp focus on pretty much everything. The whole picture will be in focus, sharp, you can see details. I can also open it up wider, and less is going to be in focus. So if you want to get those really cool looking portraits where the whole background's out of focus but the subject is right there in sharp focus, you got to get a lens that'll open up wide. This is 51.8. Now let's look at some pictures to see what these different controls look like.
Okay, this first one is an example of a fast shutter speed. I used 1/1200th of a second. If I'd used a slower shutter speed, he would have been blurry because he's moving really fast. This one is using a slow shutter speed. You can see all the blurred. Actually, this one had a flash on it too, so that the face is actually in focus. Alright, this is showing aperture. This is a very wide open aperture. You see how the background is completely blurred, but the subject is in sharp focus. This is another example of a shallow depth of field using a very wide open aperture, about f2 or f2.8. If I'd have shot this at about 5.6 or f8, all the people behind her would be in focus, and the attention wouldn't really be on the subject so much as it would be on everything in the picture. Alright, this one is an example of high ISO. I had to use a very fast ISO on this one. I think I shot this at ISO 2000. And the same with this one. I shot this at ISO 2000 to just gather light because there's not a lot of light where I was. And you may get some grainier shots depending on what kind of camera you have or what the lighting's like where you're at. But it's better to get a grainy shot than not have a shot at all. Hope you learned a little bit from this video. You can check out the website at getintophoto.com. Thanks for checking us out.